A sinkhole opened up on the George Washington Memorial Parkway. It was raining, 4 cars got in an accident. The sinkhole ended up being 10 feet by 5 feet and 30 feet deep.
Welcome to episode 5 of the Steel and Dirt podcast, where we talk about everything related to heavy equipment and construction methods. Today we're sitting down with David Heilman. He's the CEO at Jet Filter System. Their jet filter product has been around for quite a while, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But we're also going to talk about retaining wall failure. We're going to talk about erosion control, a lot more of those of you out there that are working with marine construction, flood and stormwater control, bridge abutments, applications like that. You need to pay attention because we want your upcoming projects to run as smooth and efficient as possible. And you may even save some money as well. But first off, let's welcome David to the podcast. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
We are very glad to have you here. And before we get into anything too technical, we want to take a step back and just cover some crucial fundamentals. Tell us why retaining walls fail.
Whenever a retaining wall is built, and a retaining wall is anything that is holding soil up on one side and could have water on the front side as a seawall or a bulkhead, or air and earth on the other side, which could be a retaining wall. It could be a bridge overpass, the walls holding up bridges. Any of those structures, water accumulates on the back of the wall. So groundwater is flowing towards the wall, and it needs someplace to go. That water has to be drained off. Well, traditional methods of draining water are to put in piping systems and some fabric, and they bury it behind the wall. Well, over time, that fails. And when that fails, the water needs a place to go. It's not getting out the drainage outlet that had originally been installed, and it's going to push its way out some other place. And when it does, it brings soil particles with it, and that leads to damaging the wall, voids behind the wall, and possibly sinkholes. So that's the challenge.
Are there warning signs that you would look for in a failing wall? How do you know if it's having hydrostatic pressure issues?
Great question. Well, there are a few ways you know something is going on. So, for example, if you have a seam in the wall and any of the panels seem to be moving, so they're no longer aligned, or they're sloping a little bit, being pushed out, rotated out. If there are any bulges in the wall, you know that pressure is being built up behind it. If there are seams and you see water coming through, well, that's a clear indication that the water's not going through the drainage system, it's going somewhere else. And so if you see water coming out, if you see areas where soil is built up on the front side of the wall, that's the soil leaching out. You can even tell with vegetation. So if you're standing in front of a wall and you have different types of vegetation growing in front of different places on the wall, that could be an indication as well, because different plants like different moisture. And when that happens, the water's coming through the wall at those places where they have plants that like the moisture, and drier areas have different vegetation.
Now, I'm curious, what are the major consequences if you're ignoring these failing drainage systems? What's the worst case scenario?
Well, the worst case scenario is the wall's going to collapse. The second worst case scenario is that you will get a sinkhole up behind the wall. And a sinkhole could be small or it could be fairly large. If this is on a bridge abutment, it's holding up a road, and there's a sinkhole, well, that's a big issue. Let's say it's under a playing field because there's a retaining wall. That could collapse, and then the ground is going to collapse, a couple of feet, maybe 10 feet, depends on how much soil has been washed out over time.
So lack of proper drainage, definitely the number one cause for retaining wall failure, and jet filter weep hole filters are designed to solve that problem. When was the jet filter system invented? And I'm curious about maybe some of the first few applications. Tell us how all that came about.
Well, the product was actually invented by a man, David Gentry, who had been a seawall contractor down in Florida. And so over the years, he would continue to go work on seawalls. He would go to people's homes or businesses where the seawalls were failing. And they had all the signs that we talked about earlier. You could tell that the problem was with the hydrostatic pressure. So when that's noticed or noticed that it needs to be fixed, you have to bring in a backhoe, you have to dig it up, you have to put down a new one, and then bury it again. And that's quite expensive. So he thought there's got to be a different way to do this. And he came up with the idea of, well, what if we could relieve the pressure without excavation? So just core a hole into the wall. And that's easy. But then how do you keep the soil from coming out that hole? So he first designed a geotextile filter fabric on the end, and you can put it in the hole, and it allowed the water out and stopped the soil. But then, eventually that's going to fail. So what do you do? And that came up with the idea, well, how can we make something that is maintainable? So you can inspect it at any time. You can see if it's working. If you want, you can pop it out. That soil filtration component can be brushed off, swished in water, restored to its original drainage capacity, and put right back in the wall. So how could you take something that would cost a lot of money and take a lot of time and turn it into something that takes 2 or 3 minutes every few years? So if an existing wall has a weep hole already in it, then it's really a matter of just sliding the unit into that hole and mounting for fasteners. If there's no weep hole, then it's a little bit more difficult, but simply because you have to core a hole, which you can do with a 3-inch bit or a 4-inch bit, core through the hole, through the wall, and then slide the unit into the hole and mount the fasteners.
So, what are some of the different applications where the jet filters can be used?
Well, the first jet filters were in Florida on seawalls and bulkheads in marinas. The product line has grown since then, uh, going from small plastic units to larger steel units, units with backflow prevention, large units for, let's say, Army Corps of Engineer applications. So the product line is now quite diverse, and we do a lot of work with, as I said, seawalls and bulkheads. We do work with DOTs on box culverts. So when you're driving along the road and the stream's coming through, there's a culvert down there, and they have the same issues as a seawall would have. Uh, Overpasses. So the walls holding up each side of the overpass have the same issue. Dam spillways, and retention basins. Uh, they have what's called uplift pressure issues. So sometimes those structures have no water in them, and there's no weight holding it down. So the water pressure pushes up from the bottom. And so they need to relieve that pressure so the concrete slabs don't push up. Dam spillways where they have issues with the walls. Um, we do have some where we have a product for, let's say, an underground parking structure, where you need to relieve the pressure off the wall, but you don't want the water to go onto the floor. So how would you connect that up to a drainage system to relieve the pressure and let the water drain into uh, a grate, to a sump, as opposed to draining onto the floor where people are going to be walking? The products are used in concrete applications, steel sheet pile, vinyl sheet pile, all types of sheet pile, and wooden bulkheads. So any kind of structure, the products can be used in that material.
And you mentioned earlier the cost of demoing and excavating, versus the cost of installing this type system. I can imagine there's quite a bit of savings involved in the difference of having to bring in a crew, doing a lot of demo and excavation and all of that.
Yes. Uh, just a real quick example. So we did a project with the Michigan DOT. It was a 172-foot long box culvert, and they had issues with pressure being built up on both sides of the boxes. They started to lose soil through cracks that had formed. Uh, to go in and dig up the road on both sides of the expressway to get down and replace the things that are on the sides of the walls, that's cost prohibitive. That they would not have done that because it costs way too much. So for $20,000, they were able to go and reestablish the drainage in the box culvert. So there's a significant cost differential, uh, especially if it's an existing structure. Most existing structures, you can't even get a backhoe to them because they don't have the space, or there's other things built up on top of the land. So these are extremely good for existing structures. Now, new construction, they're being put a lot in new structures because of their maintainability and inspectability, so that they can be seen and cleaned whenever necessary, as opposed to the traditional way where they have no access after they get buried.
How much knowledge is required by the person or persons looking to install the jet filter? Is it complicated? Is it simple?
It is, I would say, extremely simple, with the one portion about coring the hole. So if someone has the right tool to core a hole and knows, how to core it, they can easily do that. But it does require some specialized equipment, especially if it's a large concrete structure. And there are companies that just do that. That's their business. Then once the hole is there, it's really a matter of sliding the unit in. And this is a 6-inch unit here, and created for the Army Corps of Engineers projects. But you just have a 6-inch hole, you slide it in, and there are four, well, this has 6 screws that screw into the structure, and it's in place and ready to go.
Is there a certain location in the wall that it normally goes, or does that depend on the situation, or how does that work?
So every situation is distinct and different, but in general, you want to get the drainage component as low on the wall as possible, because the water's building up behind and you want the water to come down to the level of the drainage outlet. So you want to put it low on the wall. Um, we usually say centered 4 to 6 inches above the soil line, or above the mean water line if it's used in a seawall application.
Now, you offer both an open end and closed end model. Is that correct? Can you tell us the difference?
So we have our original products all had what we called open end, which means that the water would flow out, and there was just a grate to keep critters out. But any water coming from the front side would be able to enter into the drainage outlet. So we worked with the city of Fort Lauderdale. They had a new seawall ordinance where they did not want water to enter back into any drainage outlet. The issue is not so much that water gets behind the wall, because water is behind the wall anyway. The problem is that wave action and storm pressures hitting the wall, when they enter into the outlet, they disrupt the backfill and pull backfill towards the front out of the hole. So the closed end is, we call it backflow prevention, and it is designed to stop the water from disrupting behind the backfill.
You touched a little bit about maintenance earlier. What's typically involved in how you maintain that system and how often?
So this is it's a 3-inch model, and it would be installed on the wall. And what you're seeing here is a valve. This is the backflow prevention. And it is held in place by 4 bolts. bolted to this flange here. Unscrewing those, pop it out, take a toothbrush, brush it off, swish it in water, stick it back in, and put in the 4 bolts. So maintenance literally is 2 to 3 minutes per unit. And the frequency of maintenance is site specific. So if the units, for example, are going into a good, what we call a permeable backfill, so the water is draining through the soil and getting to the filter, typically we would say every 2 to 5 years frequency of maintenance. We do recommend that they be reviewed after the first year. And if they're working fine, if after a rain event you see water coming out, they don't need to be maintained. So you don't even need to open them if you can visually see that it's working. Now, some locations have a lot more clay in the soil, and that type of situation would require more frequent cleaning. But still, we're talking about every 1 to 3 years for those types of applications.
You mentioned earlier talking about formation of sinkholes. Let's just say that has happened. They've went in and repaired the sinkhole. Should they still consider getting a filter system in there?
Absolutely. Um, so if they just fill the sinkholes, they may not have addressed the actual problem, which is where's that soil coming out of the wall. So, for example, they could just bring in fill it up, but then over the next years, the soil's disappearing again because it's still has no place to go or is passing out. Uh, but if they fix those areas on the wall, uh, now they're trapping the water behind the wall because now the water needs to find a new location to escape. And so it's going to go somewhere else or it's going to break through the wall. But it still needs to get out, and they're still going to have soil fines going with it when it finds its new path out from behind the wall. Uh, Oftentimes, voids are fixed by doing what's called injection grouting. So they'll put probes into the soil and they'll have this expandable foam type material that fills the voids. When they do that, especially if they're sealing right along the wall, they have to put something in that is going to drain through the wall and through that foam, for lack of a better word. So they need to have a drainage system. So in these instances, it's very important that they figure out a new drainage system. And the jet filters, maintainable weep hole filters, are the perfect solution for that.
What about some specific projects you could tell us about that somebody might say, "Oh, I know where that's at," or I know where that's located?
Well, in 2014, a sinkhole opened up on the George Washington Memorial Parkway, right above a bridge abutment. And it was in the middle of the night. It was raining. 4 cars got in an accident trying to avoid this sinkhole. Sinkhole ended up being 10 feet by 5 feet and 30 feet deep. So they had to have emergency, closing the road. Um, what they discovered is that the soil filtration behind the wall had failed. And so all the soil fines had been exiting the drainage outlet and were all down, all the soil was down below the bridge. And over time, voids got created and they just happened to collapse during that rain event. And that caused the sinkhole. Um, the impact, not only was this very expensive for the Federal Lands Highway to come in and fix, but there were about 5,000 commuters that took that route to and from DC every day. Well, many of them still had to get to work, and the alternate path was a toll road that charged by the number of cars on the road. So a normal commute for those people was less than $1. Now you had thousands of cars coming and trying to get onto this tollway where you have to pay by car, and that price hit $14.40 for one of their commutes. So there was a tremendous impact to the community. Um, we've done a number of projects for like bank stabilization. Now, people may not have know about the project, but in the Houston area, they have these big reservoirs where when the hurricane comes, the reservoirs are supposed to hold the water. Well, the rivers and tributaries coming into those reservoirs over time been redesigned. The banks have sloughed off, and all the soil fines have gone into the reservoir and taken the place of where the water should have been by hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of silt that had been going down. So, hurricane comes, they didn't have a place for the water because all this silt was there. That caused a major issue in Houston. And as a result, the tributaries coming into that particular reservoir, they put steel sheet pile along the banks where the soil would be sloughing off from the way the river's flowing, and then put the units in to those steel sheet pile so that they could ensure that when these hurricanes came and the pressure built up on the behind the wall, that they had speed to drain. Because when you have a rain event, uh, water is going to build up behind that wall very quickly, especially if it's like a hurricane, waves overtopping, the soil fills up with water. And it's that time that the wall is in its most perilous place because the water has to quickly drain off. And if the water has to leak through different paths, it's going to go slowly. If it's allowed to drain off quickly, like through the weep hole filters, then they have better protection for their walls.
That's very interesting. You know, it's funny, we ride around all the time on these interstates and highways and we see retaining walls and never really understand what goes on behind the scenes. It's been interesting. Anything else you can tell us about Jet Filter and maybe future plans, and let everybody know how they can find you as well?
Sure. Well, first of all, you can find us at jetfiltersystem.com. We have, as I said earlier, we've been expanding our product line. We do have a couple of products that are specialty products. We talked about backflow prevention, and that really being for storm surge. We also have newer products that are used in dam basins or other areas where there could be significant head pressure, and they need to not allow any water back behind the wall. So we have high performance valves that join up with our soil filtration component to be used either vertically or horizontally for applications where they could have 25, 30 feet of water pressure going down on it.
And David, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a very busy person and have a lot going on, and we really appreciate you taking time out to visit with us.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to educate people on our products.